Reconstruction, success or failure. In the spring of 1865, the cruel war was over. More than 700,000 Americans, remember both sides are Americans, were dead. The South's economy, culture, and of course slavery were destroyed. Ratification of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery in the United States occurred later that year in 1865. It became the law of the land. Slavery in the United States was over, a direct result of the war. But peace had come only on the battlefield. As one northern newspaper editor wrote, "Cannon conquer, but they do not convert." So the North faced the task of reconstructing a ravaged and resentful South. Difficult questions confronted the leaders of the North. How should the new Southern state governments be formed? Secondly, how, if at all, were the freed slaves to be helped? Should the federal government help the freedmen? Such complex questions would have tested the wisdom, the courage, the patience of Abraham Lincoln. But unfortunately, the nation had no such leader now. In addition, the leaders of the United States, the restored Union, did not have the luxury of time. You have to make decisions. Devastation in the South. Few Northerners realized the extent to which the South had been physically destroyed or damaged. General Sherman's famous March to the Sea, though often exaggerated in terms of its ferocity and savagery in later years by Southerners generally, was damaging enough. In reality, it looked like a, quote, a broad black streak of ruin and desolation, but that was only a relatively small part of the South. Still, there was substantial damage. As Union troops occupied the former rebel states, it was readily apparent to them that they were hated. People cursed at them. People spat on them. The women of New Orleans were famous for emptying their chamber pots from the second story of buildings down onto the street, waiting for soldiers clad in blue to come by. You know what a chamber pot is? If you don't, it's because you're a beneficiary of modern plumbing. A Virginia woman expressed the common view, a view that would survive several generations of Southerners, and in some places, survives to this day. She wrote, "Every day, every hour that I live increases my hatred and detestation and loathing of that race. The Yankees disgrace our common humanity." She's talking about white Northerners. "As a people, I consider them vastly inferior to the better classes of our slaves." See, in this woman's mind, human beings are ranked, right? And she clearly put herself at the top. Fervent Southern nationalists planted in their children this hatred of the Yankees and a defiance of Northern rule. And Northern rule is what's taking place in the South now. They lost the war. They're occupied. In their minds, a foreign army is telling them what to do. Another mother said that she trained her children to fear God, love the South, and live to avenge her. Another expression of Southern hatred for the North and for blacks was the Klu Klux Klan, the KKK. The Klan began in 1866, the year after the war ended. And it was dedicated to spreading terror amongst the blacks of the South, and even amongst their white supporters. The whole idea was to keep the blacks so terrified that they would stay in their place, as white Southern racists defined it, willingly, so that they would not be visited in the night by a band of Klansmen. In short, the Klan was dedicated to denying the freedmen their civil rights, the right to take part in government and in society, by keeping them afraid. So if you can't win one way, win another. Southerners have not given up. Indeed, my thesis in this lecture is that Southern hatred of the North and Southern racism will ensure that Reconstruction of the South was ultimately a failure, unsuccessful. Blacks after the war, legally free, but socially bound. In the post-war South, the freed slaves suffered most of all. According to Frederick Douglass, the black man had neither money, property, nor friends. He was freed from the old plantation, but he had nothing but the dusty road under his feet. He was freed from the old quarters that gave him shelter, but a slave to the rains of summer and the frosts of winter. He was turned loose, naked, hungry, and destitute to the open sky. Now, the federal government made a rather feeble effort to help the former slaves. It created what it called the Freedmen's Bureau in March of 1865. So the Freedmen's Bureau's purpose was to help the former slaves. It was to help them with food, with fuel, that is the firewood or whatever it would take to keep them warm. And in some very, very small places, it actually redistributed some of the land of the former masters to some of these slaves. But this was not nearly enough. It was a single-digit percentage, 2-3%, not 100% at all. So a very minimal redistribution of land. So the Freedmen's Bureau, highly controversial in the North, does not help very much. Consequently, in terms of tangible physical help, only temporary relief measures were imagined by the North's reconstruction of the South. However, the North was committed to establishing constitutional and legal rights for the freedmen. Even these rights, however, proved only temporary. They were not intended to be temporary, but they turned out to be temporary. Thus, my argument that Reconstruction of the South was, in fact, a failure, because these civil rights were temporary. Now, don't be confused. Reconstruction does not mean restoration of the Union. The war had accomplished restoration of the Union. We are one country again, technically. Reconstruction is about what the new South is going to look like politically and socially and economically. Will the freedmen have their civil rights? Is the big question. And so we have a battle over Reconstruction. There is a political battle. Political battle in the North and a political battle between the North and the South over the nature of Reconstruction. So it's helpful to understand that the war is over, but the fight continues. Lincoln's death elevated to the White House his vice president, Andrew Johnson, whose plan for Reconstruction was highly favorable to the white Southerners. Lincoln would have been more harsh on the white Southerners and more helpful to the freedmen. Johnson was going to be easy on the white Southerners and not very helpful to the freedmen. There's the problem. Many in the North disagreed with Johnson. They wanted to help the black freedmen more. They wanted to be harsher, more judgmental on the white secessionists. So you get a battle between Johnson's soft reconciliation of the white South and a more egalitarian Reconstruction favored by those Northerners who were not supportive of Johnson. In other words, many of these Northerners favored the blacks over the white racists of the South. These Republicans wanted equality for blacks, civil rights, including the right to vote. Many of them, however, also wanted to punish the white Southerners. Johnson's plan to reconstitute the Southern states required only that in each state a native Unionist become governor of that state. What that meant was you can only elect a man who had not been a rebel. He remained a Unionist throughout the Civil War. And there were people like that in every state. Okay? Of course, those people were unpopular in those states. But now the white Southerners have to elect such a man to be their governor. And then they also had to ratify, what would you think? The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. This is Johnson's plan. Elect a native Unionist governor, a man sympathetic to the North, and ratify the 13th Amendment. Then everything else, it's up to you. That wasn't enough for most of the people in the North. Under this plan, the new state governments of the South were remarkably like the old state governments of the South from before the war. Southerners now took Johnson's plan and they unwisely took advantage of it. Because unwisely in that they were going to bait the North into acting. They're going to challenge the North. Southern states now elected many prominent Confederates to political positions. Remember, it was only the governorship that had to be a Unionist. So you can elect an old Confederate general to be a senator and go to Washington, D.C. if you want to. Alexander Stephens from Georgia was the vice president of the South during the war. Georgians elected him to the Senate. That's an in-your-face, folks. Moreover, and more ominously, these states passed what were called black codes. Black codes. The black codes were an attempt to reinstate slavery in many ways, but just change the words. Black codes, not slavery. For example, now every state was different, okay? But almost every state of the Old South had black codes, some worse than others. But for an example of a black code, blacks were required to enter into an annual labor contract. Whites were not required to do this. You had to, if you're a free black man, you had to sign a labor contract that was good for a year. And then if you were found out on the roads doing something that somebody didn't appreciate, you could be arrested for vagrancy. And then you could be, in some states, sold into private service. Because you broke the law. Oh, that's a crime. Yeah, see? Clever. Yeah. Black codes. An attempt to reinstate, at least in part, many aspects of slavery. Now, faced with such evidence of Southern determination to recreate as racist a society as they possibly could in most of the states, and then Johnson's acquiescence to this. It's okay with the president. Now, moderate Republicans in the North, realizing what's happening in the South over the first year or so of Reconstruction, became more radical. This was not what they fought the war for. And so they became more determined to reconstruct Southern society in a more egalitarian way. In short, to give the blacks their civil rights. Congress now, dominated by these moderate and then later radical Republicans, and don't be confused by that radical label. Usually in modern politics, if somebody is a radical, most of us see them as too extreme, right? Not somebody we identify with, in most cases. Well, the radical Republicans are the Republicans in the North who want to make sure that the black men, the freed slaves, have their civil rights. That's what a radical is in the North. So don't be confused by the language. So these Republicans now attempt to take control of Reconstruction from the President of the United States. It may be helpful to think of the Civil War as a conflict over slavery. This is what I've been teaching you for a month. Reconstruction is a conflict over the civil rights of the freedmen. Congress versus the President. In March of 1867, Congress now, because of the elections of 1866, dominated by Republicans. They enjoy a veto-proof, in other words, the president can't stop them. There are so many radical Republicans, they control Congress, they can pass whatever legislation they want. Okay? They passed several laws which would eventually lead to the impeachment of the president. And I hope you know, especially given our current circumstances, the definition of the word impeachment. It does not mean to remove the president. It means to try the president, to put him or her on trial. And then, depending on which way the trial goes, acquitted, they're going to stay in office. But convicted, then removed from office. Impeachment just means trial. And it's during the trial when all the evidence is supposed to come out. There's a poll out for the last, several months, which demonstrates the American people don't get it yet. Even though we went through this in the late 90s with Clinton. I would have thought at that point that everybody understood impeachment. But this poll asked the American people, should the president be impeached and removed from office? The proper response was, bad question. The evidence doesn't come out until he's impeached. And yet, in answering that poll question, over 50% of the American people said, yes, he should be impeached, and yes, he should be removed from office. You see how they've confused it? During the impeachment, we listen to the evidence, and then we decide. We don't have an impeachment yet. I believe the Democrats are close to voting for one, probably maybe even this week. But then there will be a trial. And in an impeachment trial, the House of Representatives acts as the prosecuting attorney. The Chief Justice of the United States acts as the judge. And the Senate acts as the jury. Okay? Is everybody clear on impeachment? Okay. So, In March of 1867, the Republican-dominated Congress passed laws that would eventually lead to the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. One of these was the Military Reconstruction Act that took control of Reconstruction from the president and gave it to Congress. I've always thought this was an inappropriately titled act. Military Reconstruction. It should have been Congressional Reconstruction Act. But it's the Military Reconstruction Act. The act abolished the existing Reconstruction state governments in the South. So those governments that were created in the South under Andrew Johnson's version of Reconstruction, they're gone. You Southerners have to start over again, and the rules are going to be different now. It established military control of those states and occupation. Southerners are not running their own affairs. The military is, the Union Army. It called for conventions to create new state governments under a more structured and egalitarian system. These new state governments will have to approve of universal male suffrage, that every male in the state can vote. That includes blacks. Congress has to approve the new state constitutions. And they also have to approve the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment guaranteed civil rights to all citizens. Okay. 14th Amendment. 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. 14th Amendment takes away, guarantees civil rights to all citizens. So remember what I said at the beginning of the hour. Why do we have to have a, quote, civil rights movement beginning in the 1950s and into the 1960s, culminating in Civil Rights Acts in 1964? Great question. You got the 14th Amendment on the books. That's the Civil Rights Amendment. Americans effectively forgot it for 100 years. Hence the failure of Reconstruction. I didn't mention the 15th yet. The 15th Amendment is an exclamation point on the 14th Amendment. It picks out voting rights and asserts the voting rights of the freedmen, of American citizens again. Okay? So there you go. 13th, slavery, over. 14th, civil rights. 15th, voting rights. Great question. That's the kind of test question I can imagine. Okay? I really can. So this is a radically different Reconstruction. A Reconstruction focused on the rights of the freedmen, black Americans. The Tenure of Office Act made it illegal for the president to remove a cabinet officer without Senate consent. So this meant that if the president wanted to fire his Secretary of War, he had to get the Senate to approve of this. You can imagine how any president then, now, whatever, would view this as an infringement on their power. Okay. Impeachment. So Johnson is watching all of this, and he decides to ignore these laws on the theory that they were all unconstitutional. And so he's determined to test the constitutionality of these laws, and ultimately this is going to decide who controls Reconstruction. So now Johnson removed the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who had served Lincoln during the Civil War as Secretary of War. And this, of course, was a violation of the Tenure of Office Act according to the new law. So on February 24th, 1868, the House voted to impeach the president. We are on the verge of such a vote today. But we are still waiting for it. Most of the charges that the House then brought against the president had to do with the Tenure of Office Act. There's no question that Johnson's impeachment was political. You are not behaving politically the way we want you to behave regarding Reconstruction. That's it. Johnson's Reconstruction program was not egalitarian enough. So Congress moves against him. The Senate trial now opened in March of 1868. The crucial vote comes in May. Most Republicans voted guilty. We're going to get rid of him, right? That's what you would expect. It's political. Democrats, of course, voted to support him. It was Johnson's version of Reconstruction that the Democrats, both of the North and of the South, liked. It's soft on the whites. But enough Republicans crossed the party lines and voted with the Democrats to spare Johnson conviction by one vote. So that means Johnson's been impeached, he's acquitted, he stays in office. Results of the trial. In the impeachment of Johnson, Congress won its battle over Reconstruction. I'll explain why. Before the vote, there are maneuverings behind the scenes. Johnson agreed not to obstruct congressional Reconstruction. Johnson said, okay, you win. You can run Reconstruction. And what was the deal? Johnson gets to remain president of the United States. So that's it. Quid pro quo. This for that. Johnson remains president. The vote spares him in the Senate. But Johnson agrees that Congress is going to run Reconstruction. Well, it was always about that, wasn't it? Yeah. But now Congress is going to run Reconstruction. And this is that classic Reconstruction period. From this moment on until 1877, so about a decade. The primary difference between the president and Congress was over the civil rights of the former slaves. Congress wanted to be sure that the black man had his civil rights. In the 1860s and early 1870s, Congress was willing to use the Army, the Union Army, the blue coats, spread throughout the South, an army of occupation, to ensure that blacks had their civil rights. There's a Union soldier there. You don't have to rely on the local sheriff. The local sheriff in the South is most likely a Klansman. See? Local judges, local prosecutors, not all, but a good number of them, wore the white sheet at night. Why did they do that? So they could not be identified. So the Union Army then could not go arrest them. That's why they wore the white sheets, the mask. If the Union Army hadn't been down there, there would have been no need to wear the white sheets, right? The vast majority of those people believed as the Klansmen did. So at this time then, for this decade, the Union, the North, is making sure the blacks have their civil rights. This is the golden age for blacks of the South. A decade in which blacks ran for Congress and were elected. They ran for local office and were elected. They owned businesses on main streets of towns. And most of the time they were unafraid. Still, there's the Klan. But there's also the Union Army. So again, a golden age for blacks. And then it's all going to go away. Evaporate. Well, in further response to Southern obstinance, Congress, as I've already mentioned, passed the 14th Amendment in June of 1868 in an effort to strengthen the civil rights of black Americans. It reaffirmed, and you really only need to know it's a civil rights amendment, but I'll go through the particulars. Reaffirmed state and federal citizenship for any native-born person. Born in the country, you're a citizen. Reaffirm the rights of life, liberty, happiness, and due process under law. Again, civil rights. Now, Reconstruction ends. You can put a date on it. Reconstruction, known as Radical Reconstruction from the Radical Republicans, formally ended in 1877. When Republicans agreed to withdraw the Union Army from its occupation duties in the southern states. So there it is, 1877, the Republicans agreed to bring the boys home to the north. Without the Union Army there, what's going to happen? They made this deal in 1877 after the election of 1876, the presidential election of 1876, in return for the Democrats giving up the presidency. It's a very close election. In 1876, the presidential election was so close that neither Republican Rutherford B. Hayes nor Democrat Samuel Tilden had won enough electoral votes to be named president of the United States. It's essentially a tie. And so the Great Compromise, another quid pro quo, this for that. The Great Compromise of 1877 ended Reconstruction and gave the Republican Hayes the presidency. This time, the Republican president says, okay, I'll take the office, but we agree, the Republicans agree, to bring the Union soldiers home. People of the North had wearied of the expense, the effort, the fight. And then, of course, many of the Democrats had become powerful enough, both in the South and in the other parts of the country that had a lot of Democrats. And so this election, Republicans couldn't win it. So the compromise. While congressional Reconstruction brought the states of the Confederacy back into the Union, it was not successful ultimately in providing civil rights permanently to black people in America. And I'm careful in my choice of words there. It's not just the South that is eventually going to deny civil rights to blacks. This racism is going to creep back up into northern cities as well. But of course, the home of it is the Old South. Once Reconstruction ended with the Great Compromise of 1877, southern states now gradually, it doesn't happen overnight now, but over the next 20 years, these southern states are gradually taken over by white supremacists. And they gradually took away the civil rights of the former slaves. The Golden Age was over in 1877. Questions? Yes? Yeah, the Civil Rights Amendment. Yeah. Yes? Okay, well, the elections are changing the nature of Congress during this time as well. So they no longer have that veto that they can override. The Democratic Party is strengthening all through this time.
Well, I mean, why would, if they still have control over Reconstruction,
yeah.
why would they care about?
Well, because the deal in the Great Compromise is that they no longer are exercising that control, okay? That the Republican Party is agreeing that they're going to give up control over Reconstruction. The boys are coming home. The way they have control over it is because the Union Army is there on the ground, okay? Those soldiers are coming home now. Yeah, good question. Anybody else? Yes?
Do you think if Lincoln had lived, there would have been violence?
So this is a what if, and what ifs are almost impossible to be certain of. But Lincoln's Reconstruction was relatively kind, but not as kind as Johnson's, okay? And Lincoln, by the end of the war, had become convinced that a lot of blacks, he called them deserving blacks, especially soldiers, people who had been educated and so forth, these people should have civil rights. And I think as Lincoln would have, because he's always responding to events, okay, that I think Lincoln would have seen how the South was intransigent at this point, and then Lincoln would have moved more closely to the radical Republicans, so that you probably would have ended up with the 14th and 15th Amendments as well under Abraham Lincoln. It would have looked different. There probably would have been no impeachment, see. But the disagreement would have been between the Republicans and with Lincoln, I think, moving closer to the radical position. But no one can say for sure what happened. Yeah. But Andrew Johnson does not have the prestige, nearly, of an Abraham Lincoln. Yeah. Anybody else? God bless you all.